Second World War today. So please can we have a round of applause for Antony.
So I say thank you very much indeed. I'm going to talk mainly about the Second World War, but also about some of the consequences. Even after so many years of work on the subject of the Second World War, historians, I think, are still overawed by its scope, by its size, and, of course, by its consequences. It was almost certainly the greatest human tragedy ever known. The conflict stretched from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, from the snowfields of Norway and Finland to the Libyan desert, from jungle fighting in Burma and on the islands of the Pacific Rim, all the way to the massacres by SS Einsatzgruppen in the borderlands of Central Europe. For those involved in the fighting on one side of the world, battles on the other side could almost have been taking place on another planet. And when it came to the unspeakable horrors of the Sino-Japanese War, they were reminiscent of the conspicuous cruelty of marauding hordes in the Dark Ages to terrorize peaceful populations into submission. Comprehension today in a post-military health and safety environment is indeed difficult. It's very hard to appreciate the huge historical forces which killed those 60 to 70 million people. When we dwell on the enormity of the Second World War and its victims, we try and fail to absorb the reality of all those statistics of national and ethnic tragedy. The Poles lost nearly 6 million people, almost a fifth of their population. The Chinese lost more than 20 million. Estimates of total Soviet losses range from 24 to 26 million. Stalin knew in 1945 that more than 20 million Soviet citizens had died, but he tried to conceal this. As Professor David Reynolds, Professor of International Relations at Cambridge, once pointed out, he settled for 7.5 million as a figure that sounded suitably heroic but not criminally homicidal, so less than a third of the true figure. Experiences and memories of the Second World War are so different that it's not surprising that each country has their own historical version of events. For Americans, the war started in December 1941, when Hitler declared war on the United States. For Russians, they believed it began only in June 1941 with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Most Europeans, on the other hand, consider that it commenced in Poland in September 1939. But for the Chinese, it started in 1937 with the Sino-Japanese War. And there are still many in Spain who are convinced that it began in July 1936 with General Franco's rising against the Spanish Republic. Historians often extend the conflict even further, arguing over the long war of the 20th century. Some say it lasted from 1914 to 1945. Others extend the period until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. The statistics of suffering and the sheer size of the numbers are dangerously numbing, as the Soviet Jewish writer Vasily Grossman instinctively understood. In his view, the duty of survivors was to try to recognize the millions of ghosts from the mass graves as individuals, not as nameless people in caricatured categories, because that sort of dehumanization was precisely what the perpetrators had sought to achieve. But focusing entirely on the dead makes us overlook the way that the Second World War also marked the life of survivors. For example, I heard from a German friend that her sister's father-in-law had died. His most intense memory came from January 1945 in East Prussia, when he was only 10 years old. To escape the indiscriminate vengeance of the Red Army, his mother had taken him and his older siblings on foot across the frozen lagoon of the Frischeshaff. The ice began breaking up all around, with many people falling through to freeze and drown. Almost 3/4 of a century later, his last words before he died were, "I can hear the cracking of the ice." In the mad scheme of such a war, human life was intensely fragile, and survival was totally unpredictable. In the Archives Nationales in Paris, I came across a short paragraph in a June 1945 report by the French security police, the DST. They recorded that a German farmer's wife had been found in Paris, having somehow smuggled herself onto a train returning French deportees from camps in Germany. It transpired that she'd had an illicit affair with a French prisoner of war assigned to their farm in Germany while her husband was on the Russian front, the Eastern Front. And she'd fallen so much in love with this enemy of her country that she'd followed him to Paris, where she was picked up by the police. That was all the detail provided. These few lines raised so many questions. Would her difficult journey have been in vain even if she'd not been picked up by the police? Had her lover given her the wrong address because he was already married? And had he returned home, as quite a few did, to find that his wife had had a baby in his absence by a German soldier? A recent book in France estimated that around 100,000 babies, known as enfants de guerre, or more viciously, bâtards de Boche, had been fathered by German soldiers during the occupation. I think this figure is an exaggeration, but some have even come up with far higher estimates. A more reliable estimate is that some 20,000 women had their heads shaved. In any case, the bare bones of the story of the farmer's wife could almost have been a novel by Marguerite Duras. It is, of course, a tiny tragedy in comparison to the horrors of the Eastern Front. But it remains a poignant reminder that the consequences of decisions by leaders such as Stalin and Hitler ripped apart the traditional fabric of existence and changed lives forever. Many aspects are not as they appear on the surface, as I've often learned over the years. I remember, as a young officer in Germany, based next door to Belsen concentration camp, being horrified by a memorial to the French Jews who died there. It stated, "Aux Juifs français qui sont morts pour la gloire et la patrie." I found the idea of French Jews dying for glory and the fatherland quite grotesque in such squalid circumstances. Many years later, I mentioned this to the French historian, Henri Rousseau. He replied, "I entirely understand your reaction, but you're completely wrong. It was the French Jews themselves who insisted after the war that memorials to their dead should have exactly the same wording as those for all the other French. And this was because they would never forgive Vichy for having tried to take away their French citizenship." Interestingly, while the wartime generation clung to their French nationality, their children and grandchildren were far more likely to emigrate to Israel. Perhaps the hardest for almost all of us to comprehend fully is the true experience of soldiers during the war. The conditions under which men fought were so desperate that today we can hardly imagine how they endured. Even many who were there look back in astonishment. One Red Army officer, Vladimir Ivanovich Chulianev, said, "Nowadays I can't believe that we were able to live in the trenches, in the open, in the snow, never taking off our shoes or clothes, with no water or source of heat. How on earth did we survive all that?" Between 1941 and 1945, some Red Army soldiers, those who survived the battles along the way, fought and marched for more than 12,000 kilometers. Red Army soldiers, afraid both of their Nazi enemy and of execution by their own side, were put under terrible psychological pressure. They and Soviet civilians were crushed pitilessly between the two totalitarian regimes. Red Army snipers at Stalingrad, for example, were ordered to shoot starving Russian orphans who'd been tempted with crusts of bread by German infantrymen to fill their water bottles in the Volga. The proud brutality of Soviet commanders is simply unimaginable in Western democratic societies. When it came to ruthlessness, General Zhukov even exceeded his master Stalin. On the 4th of October 1941, Zhukov, as commander of the Leningrad front, issued the following order: to make clear to all troops that all families of those who surrendered to the enemy would be shot. Ironically, it did not occur to Zhukov when he issued this order that in theory it made Stalin himself liable to execution, since his own son, Yakov Zhukashvili, had recently surrendered. I don't think Stalin was unduly worried. He simply admired Zhukov for his pitiless determination. President Putin is always the first to claim that the Soviet Union won the Second World War in Europe single-handed. He refuses to acknowledge the American and British contribution to Soviet survival and victory on the Eastern Front. The great myth encouraged under Stalin was that the British and the Americans deliberately held back launching their Eastern Front in a cross-channel invasion in order to weaken their communist ally. In fact, any attempt to have launched D-Day, the D-Day invasion, earlier than June 1944 would have led to a terrible disaster. Putin also deliberately ignores the fact that even Stalin acknowledged that if the United States had not helped, we would not have won the war. Along with the vast supplies of steel came food supplies, which saved the Soviet Union from famine, especially in the winter of 1942 to 1943. Red Army soldiers in their dugouts used to joke on opening an American tin of Spam, "Let's open the second front." Few Russian historians, however, are yet prepared to acknowledge how the hugely controversial Allied strategic bombing campaign against German cities also helped the Soviet Union enormously. Whatever one might think about Air Chief Marshal Harris, known as Bomber Harris, his brutal and relentless bombing operations forced the Luftwaffe to withdraw the bulk of its fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft guns to defend the Reich. And this gave the Soviet Union air superiority on the Eastern Front. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns were also the Germans' most effective anti-tank guns, which made an enormous difference in the ground war. The other important side effect of the Germans losing air superiority on the Eastern Front meant that they could not carry out air reconnaissance over the Red Army's rear areas. This enabled the Soviets to carry out major deception operations, which they called maskirovka, to conceal their major offensives, such as Operation Bagration, a surprise attack which secured Belarus and eastern Poland and destroyed the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. Finally, there's one irony which Russian historians still refuse to acknowledge. If the United States had not provided 500,000 military vehicles to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, then the US Army would have reached Berlin well before the Red Army. So Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov were right, and Putin is wrong. The Soviet Union could never have defeated Hitler on its own. Much has been written about the fighting qualities of the different armies in the Second World War, especially the difference between the armies of democracies and the armies of dictatorships. Much less has been said, on the other hand, about their similarities if one studies the performance of average as opposed to elite troops. All the studies of combat performance indicate that only a small proportion of frontline troops actually engaged in combat. An initial study in the British Army was carried out in Italy by Major Lionel Wigram in 1943. Wigram estimated that in most platoons of around 30 men, only a small handful of men really did the fighting. Another small group of men were likely to run away at the first opportunity. Those in the main group in between would follow the fighters if things went well, or the potential deserters if they went badly. General Montgomery was so horrified by the report that he had it suppressed and destroyed Wigram's career. But Wigram was right. The Germans, meanwhile, divided their soldiers' combat performance into 4 categories. It was more or less the same. Die Einsatzfreudigen, those who enjoy fighting. Die Einsatzwilligen, those prepared to fight. Die Einsatzgehemmten, those reluctant to fight. And die Einsatzflüchtigen, those who will flee from their duty. So it's basically the same as Wigram's breakdown, except the Germans split the main group in the middle in 2. The American combat historian, Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, went into the subject in a great deal more detail after the war. And even though some of his research has been shown to be dubious, there can be little doubt about the overall thrust of his work, which shows that only a minority of soldiers in a conscript army actually fired at the enemy. The Red Army was no different. As we found in the Russian archives, Soviet officers argued during the war that weapons inspections should be carried out immediately after every engagement with the enemy. All those found to have clean barrels should be executed immediately as deserters. Previously unpublished letters and diaries of the time, give us an idea of personal experience. But they also reveal the attitudes of both German officers and soldiers. For example, they felt that the Wehrmacht was invincible at the start of the war. It never seemed to occur to them that the war which they were bringing so pitilessly to other countries might one day turn back against them and destroy their own homes and families. Their triumphalism in the conquest of France in 1940 was buoyed up by relief that this war on the Western Front was completely unlike the battles of attrition in Flanders a generation earlier. There are many, many German divisions here who haven't fired a shot, a corporal in the 1st Infantry Division wrote home. And at the front, the enemy are running away. French and English, equal adversaries in the World War, the First World War, refuse to take us on now. Just imagine positions like Amiens, Léon, Chemin des Dames are falling within hours. In 1914 to 1918, they were fought over for years. The face of war is dreadful, a German soldier from the 269th Division wrote home on the 20th of May. We live like gods in France. If we need meat, a cow is slaughtered and only the best cuts are taken, and the rest is discarded. With our rifles in our hand, we then break into a house, and our hunger is sated. Terrible, isn't it? But one gets used to anything. Thank God these conditions don't prevail at home. The idea that the Führer had spared Germany such horrors, a typical confusion of cause and effect, became a constant refrain in soldiers' letters. That attitude only changed 4 years later when retribution approached. Preparations for the massive assault on the Soviet Union prompted similar hopes of rapid victory. Forests of birch and fir along the Nazi-Soviet frontier concealed vehicle parks, tented headquarters and signal regiments, as well as fighting units. Officers briefed their men, reassuring them that it would only take 3 or 4 weeks to crush the Red Army. The unnatural alliance of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was over. Early tomorrow morning, wrote a soldier in a mountain division, we're off, thanks be to God, against our mortal enemy Bolshevism. For me, a real stone has fallen from my heart. Finally, this uncertainty is over, and one knows where one is. I am very optimistic, and I believe that we can take all the land and raw materials up to the Urals, then Europe will be able to fuel itself, and it will not matter how long the war at sea lasts. A fierce sense of relief also affected Soviet citizens that this treacherous attack had released them from the unnatural alliance with Nazi Germany. But this war of annihilation, as Hitler called it, was pitiless. The Russian is a tough opponent, wrote a German soldier. We take hardly any prisoners and shoot them all instead. When reinforcements were marching forward, some took potshots for fun at crowds of Red Army prisoners being herded back to makeshift camps where they were left to starve in the open. Thousands of Soviet citizens died in the bombing of the cities of Belarus. Survivors fared little better in their attempts to escape eastwards. After Minsk began to burn, a journalist noted, blind men from the Home for Invalids walked along the highway in a long file, tied to one another with towels. Beyond the repression and starvation of ordinary Soviet citizens lay the far darker forces of Himmler's killing squads, the Einsatzkommandos. One day, a German transport Gefreiter corporal, accompanied by their company clerk, happened to see men, women, and children with their hands bound together with wire being driven along the road by SS people. They went to see what was happening. Outside the village, they saw a 150-meter trench about 3 meters deep. Hundreds of Jews had been rounded up. The victims were forced to lie in the trench in rows so that an SS man on each side who could walk along, shooting them with captured Soviet submachine guns. Then people were again driven forward, and they had to get in and lie on top of the dead. At that moment, a young girl, she must have been about 12 years old, cried out in a clear, piteous, shrill voice, "Let me live, I'm still only a child." The child was grabbed, thrown in the ditch, and shot. Only a few managed to flee the killing pits. On the northeastern edge of Ukraine, Vasily Grossman encountered one of them. A girl, a Jewish beauty, who's managed to escape from the Germans, has bright, absolutely insane eyes, he wrote in his notebook. By the spring of 1944, the situation had completely changed. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Red Army soldiers advancing westwards had much to avenge. As the Wehrmacht's retreat continued, nervous breakdown became a much more open subject in letters home to Germany. Psychologically, wrote a gunner in a heavy artillery battery, I'm finding it increasingly hard to manage when you've just been having a good chat with a comrade, and half an hour later you see him as little more than scraps of flesh, as if he'd never existed. Or comrades who are lying badly in front of you in a large pool of their own blood, and beg you with pleading eyes to help them, because in most cases they can't speak anymore. That is terrible. This war is a crushing war of nerves. When, in April 1945, the German front line began to break east of Berlin, traumatized survivors ran back shouting, Der Ivan kommt. Further back, local farmers and their families also started to flee. Refugees hurry by like creatures of the underworld, wrote a young soldier. Women, children, and old men surprised in their sleep, some only half-dressed. In their faces is despair and deadly fear. Crying children holding their mother's hands look out at the world's destruction with shocked eyes. As Berliners awaited the arrival of the Red Army, people prepared to meet their conquerors in different ways, either frivolous or tragic. In the Adlon Hotel, staff and customers listened to the sound of artillery shells. In the dining room, wrote a Norwegian journalist, the few guests were overwhelmed by the readiness of waiters to pour the wine in a constant stream. They did not want to leave any for the Russians. On the other hand, some fathers, as they left to join their Volkssturm unit to defend Berlin, thought only of the fate awaiting their families. It's all over, my child, one told his daughter, handing her his pistol. Promise me that when the Russians come, you will shoot yourself. He then kissed her and left. Others killed their wives and children and then committed suicide themselves. In the Far East, before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Malaya, the appalling complacency and racial arrogance of colonial society had produced a dangerous self-deception. The British convinced themselves that all Japanese soldiers were very short-sighted and inherently inferior to Western troops. In fact, they were immeasurably tougher, far more mobile and astonishingly self-sufficient. They did not need bridging equipment. Their soldiers cut thick bamboos, then threw themselves in pairs into the river and bent forward with the bamboos running from shoulder to shoulder in parallel to form a bridge for their comrades to run over. Japanese soldiers had been brought up in a militaristic society. Their mothers would lovingly prepare a 1,000-stitch scarf for them to wear, supposedly to ward off bullets. The whole village or neighborhood, paying homage to these martial values, would usually turn out to bid farewell to a conscript departing to join the army. Soldiers dreaded disgracing their family and their community. And this, according to a number of Japanese historians, was far more powerful than ideas of dying in glory for the emperor. Their basic training was designed to destroy individuality. Recruits were constantly insulted, slapped, and beaten by their sergeants and corporals to toughen them up. In what might be called the knock-on theory of oppression, this treatment was also intended to provoke them to take their anger in turn out on the soldiers and civilians of a defeated enemy. All of them had also been indoctrinated since elementary school to believe that the Chinese were totally inferior to the divine race of Japanese and were below pigs. One Japanese soldier admitted that although he'd been horrified by the gratuitous torture of a Chinese prisoner, he'd asked to be allowed to take part to make up for some perceived insult. During the rape of Nanking in December 1937, Japanese officers made Chinese prisoners kneel in rows, then practiced beheading them one by one with their samurai swords. Their soldiers were also ordered to carry out bayonet practice on thousands of Chinese prisoners bound up or tied to trees. Any soldier who refused was beaten severely by their NCOs. The Imperial Japanese Army's process of dehumanizing its troops was stepped up as soon as they arrived in China from the home islands. A Corporal Nakamura, who'd himself been conscripted against his will, described in his diary how they made some new recruits watch as they tortured 5 Chinese civilians to death. The newcomers were horrified, but Nakamura wrote, "All new recruits are like this, but they'll soon be doing the same things themselves." John Rabe, the German businessman from Siemens, who courageously organized a safety zone in Nanking, wrote in his diary, "I am totally puzzled by the conduct of the Japanese. On the one hand, they want to be recognized and treated as a great power on a level with European powers. On the other, they are currently displaying a crudity, brutality, and bestiality that bears no comparison except with the hordes of Genghis Khan." Imperial Japanese Navy pilots would sit down to play bridge together in what they considered a respectful imitation of British Royal Navy officers in the wardroom. But they would behead any shot-down American pilot pulled from the sea. Japan in the 1930s had become a dangerous combination of ancient culture and parvenu power. I think that in the course of all of my researches, the discovery that shocked me the most was the way that the Japanese military authorities did not merely condone, but actively encourage cannibalism, especially towards the end of the war. These were not isolated cases. A similar pattern was found across the army in China and Pacific garrisons, who'd been cut off from supplies by the US Navy. It became clear from all of the reports collected later by American authorities and the Australian War Crimes Section that the widespread practice of cannibalism by Japanese soldiers in the Asia-Pacific War was something more than merely random incidents perpetrated by individuals or small groups subject to extreme conditions. The testimonies indicate that cannibalism was a systematic and organized military strategy. Both locals and Allied prisoners of war, especially those who remained loyal to the British from the Indian Army, were kept alive as human cattle and then butchered for their meat one by one. Allied authorities, understandably afraid of the horror that this would cause to the families of those who died in prison camps, decided to suppress the facts entirely. As a result, cannibalism never featured in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946. The Japanese dehumanization of their enemies in the Second World War was also rapidly reflected. The hatred felt by most US Marines and soldiers was hardened by the Japanese suicidal resistance and by their cruel treatment of Allied prisoners. American troops, like most British troops in Burma, refused to see the Japanese enemy as human. Men from the 1st Marine Division landing in New Britain the day after Christmas in 1943 were told by the commander, "Don't squeeze that trigger until you got meat in your sights, and when you do spill blood, spill yellow blood." And some Marines decapitated Japanese corpses in order to boil the head and sell the skull when they got back home. On the 9th of May, 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the rifle companies of the 1st US Marine Division during the battle for Okinawa, their reaction was, so what? They were exhausted and filthy, and everything around them stank. As far as they were concerned, the war in Europe was indeed another war on another planet. After the savage fighting on Okinawa, there remained the even more dreadful prospect of invading the Japanese home islands of Honshu and Hokkaido, where soldiers and civilians alike were preparing to fight on to the death. No less than 18 million civilians had been recruited into militia and were expected to fight the Americans with bamboo spears and explosive charges, i.e. as suicide bombers. None of the Marines then, of course, knew of the atomic bombs prepared in such secrecy. It was not just the nuclear age and the Cold War which began in 1945. The consequences of the Second World War reshaped the world. It also brought world history together for the very first time, partly because of the global reach of the conflict, but also because it sealed the fate of colonialism. In the Far East, the defeat of the Japanese and the advance of the Soviet Red Army across northern China and Mongolia enabled Mao Zedong's Communist Party to win the Civil War and centralize the country. Although impossible to imagine at the time, this centralization of communist power would enable China 7 decades later to become a capitalist economic giant and then a military superpower. One of the great debates of recent years has been over the origins of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. Did Stalin outmaneuver Churchill and Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference and then break his word over free and fair elections in Poland? almost certainly. But Churchill was indeed far too optimistic, if not self-deluding. "I have great hopes of this conference," he told the House of Commons before leaving, "because it comes at a moment when a good many moulds can be set out to receive a great deal of molten metal." Churchill was suffering from the heady illusion that the so-called Big Three could remake the international order on a stable footing. "We had the world at our feet, 25 million men marching at our orders by land and sea. We seem to be friends." Many argue that the Cold War started in 1947 with the Clay-Robertson Agreement to revive West Germany and the announcement of the Marshall Plan for American aid to a war-devastated Europe. But at an international conference in Brussels on the 70th anniversary of Yalta, I think it became clear that the origins of the Cold War in fact lay in Stalin's traumatic shock and humiliation on the 22nd of June 1941, when the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union, after his obsessive refusal to acknowledge the possibility. Stalin's paranoid fear of surprise attack afterwards made him even more determined to create a cordon sanitaire of communist satellite states centered on Poland and East Germany to make sure that the Soviet Union could never be taken by surprise again. Ever since its medieval origins, Russia had been paranoid about encirclement and consequently obsessed with occupying or controlling its neighbors of the near abroad. We are in the age of fake news, as President Trump of all people so bizarrely keeps reminding us. But as we see from Putin's quite shameless contempt for the truth, lies are the weapons of choice for dictators and aspiring autocrats. It recently reached a new level. Regimes have actually started to finance movies to try to turn historical fantasy into fact. In Russia, President Putin ordered the financing and production of a film called Panfilov and His 28 Men. This is a story in the Battle for Moscow in December 1941, when a small group of men were supposed to have held up a whole German panzer division on their own. Sergei Mironenko, the highly regarded head of the State Archive of the Russian Federation, was sacked in March 2016 for revealing that official documents showed that this whole account had simply been invented by a journalist as part of Soviet propaganda. Yet Vladimir Medinsky, the Minister for Culture, said that anyone who denied the story, whether or not it was true, was below slime. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party commissioned a movie about the Smolensk plane crash, which was trying to give substance to their own conspiracy theory that this accident, due entirely, in fact, to human stupidity, was actually a deliberate plot to kill their president. Now, in the midst of alarming global instability, social, political, climatic, technological, and economic, it is understandable that people look again at the Second World War partly as a cautionary tale, but also as one that can alert us to danger signals and perhaps offer useful signposts towards a more peaceful future. That, at least, is the optimistic viewpoint. Others might argue that we've learned little from history's greatest human tragedy and are blindly headed towards another global conflict. Of course, we need to understand the past to make better sense of what's happening around us now. But we must avoid the temptation to generalize or draw bogus parallels. The Second World War was indeed a complex business, and our understanding of it must be equally nuanced. We tend, for example, to reduce the war to a battle between major powers. Some misleadingly portray it as a fight between democracy and dictatorship. In fact, it was a conglomeration of different conflicts. Some were great power rivalries, yet all, to a certain degree, were influenced by the international civil war between the polarized extremes of communism and fascism from the 1930s. The sheer brutality of the Second World War is underlined by the fact, for the first time in history, far more civilians were killed than combatants. This can only be explained in terms of ideologically fueled dehumanization. Nationalism stirred to a fever pitch and extolling racism as a virtue, but also Leninist class warfare aiming to exterminate the bourgeoisie. Not surprisingly, the Soviet Union fought tooth and nail after the war to prevent class warfare from being included in the international definition of genocide. In any case, the great Soviet physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov observed that Stalin may have killed more people, but Hitler had to be defeated first, and he was, of course, quite right. If the Nazis had succeeded in defeating the Soviet Union, their so-called hunger plan to reduce the population by 35 million through deliberate famine would have dwarfed even the horrors of the Holocaust. No other period in history offers so rich a source for the study of moral choice, individual and mass tragedy, the corruption of power politics, ideological hypocrisy, the egomania of some commanders, betrayal, perversity, unbelievable sadism, but also self-sacrifice and unpredictable compassion. In short, one of the most important lessons of the Second World War is that it defies generalization and easy categories. History never repeats itself. Nothing in human affairs is inevitable. But on the other hand, I fear that the future waves of migration into Europe from an Africa devastated by global warming will present intolerable moral choices for European leaders in the relatively near future. Perhaps even harder choices than in the Second World War. Whom do they keep out? Whom do they let in? How many refugees can you allow in before democracy is destroyed by extreme right-wing nationalists and neo-fascists, supported by a frightened mass? Perhaps the Second World War's most important lesson is a moral one. Even in the midst of the most horrifying conditions on all sides, there were those who never let go of their fundamental belief in humanity. Their example, perhaps, is something worth struggling in order to resolve the profoundly disturbing challenges and the potential conflicts in the world today. Thank you very much. And we have certainly enough time for questions. So if anybody's got any questions, yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. When we were talking before the event, you mentioned this idea of war pornography as a sort of element in history writing. And actually, I was wondering if perhaps that is something that's quite useful if you're writing about something like the Second World War, that we're growing more distant from as a society. Do you think it's something that should be avoided, or something that is useful for making us relate to a conflict that seems ever more distant?
It's very, very hard to judge. I mean, especially when you've been researching and you're very, very close to the material. It's very hard to assess what is important. This is where you always need a second opinion. I mean, this actually came out of a time when Neil Ferguson attacked Max Hastings and me on air of writing war pornography and trying to be controversial, which was a bit, Max said, that's a bit rich coming from you, Neil. Anyway, but the point was that I was very lucky when doing the Berlin book, which was obviously the controversial one, because Catherine Meridell was a huge help to me by going through it and basically advising me, because there were certain things which, in fact, I did leave out. They were sort of, I think, almost too horrific. There were some things about the killing of children and so forth, which I just couldn't even really face. I mean, of children committing suicide because of what had happened. It's very, very hard to judge. You know, one could argue that you shouldn't leave anything out. I don't know. I mean, it's all part of the whole debate over history. You know, how objective can a historian be? I mean, I totally reject the German view that history is a science. History can never be a science. It's ridiculous. It can never be tested in a laboratory or anything like that. History can only be a branch of literature. And it has, if you like, the flaws and the advantages of literature as well. But it is a huge help when one does have somebody, like in my case, like Catherine, who could advise you on how things might be misunderstood or seen in the wrong way. But I think it's an argument which one can certainly a legitimate argument to have, and I don't think there's any really very, very clear answer. It's got to be up to the individual. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Listening to your talk, I was struck by some of the kind of anecdotal evidence that you kind of present about. Does this leave our understanding of the Second World War as simply a conflict that is only horrific and brutal, and that this kind of brutalizing narrative of all sides across the conflict, where does that leave us as historians? I mean, you briefly alluded to Bomber Harris and the bombing of Dresden. Does this only leave the conflict as kind of a horrific, almost Joanna Borg-esque, people enjoyed committing horrific acts? Where does this leave us as historians?
Well, I don't think it's up to the historian to make moral judgments in a strange way. I think that it's much more to be up to the reader wherever possible. No historian can be completely objective, as I was just trying to say a moment ago. And I think really the moral judgment has to come from the reader. Again, it's always a question of selection of the material. You can, and this is why nobody can ever write a totally objective history of anything. Let's face it, if you were going to put in every known fact, it would be completely unreadable. It would be completely impossible to digest. So there has to be an element of selection in that particular way, and one's well aware of the limitations in that way. What I'm trying to say is that I don't think anybody can come up with neat conclusions about the Second World War, because there are so many contradictions in many ways. There are contradictions both in the strategies of the different sides, the way that many were allies who had to fight together even though they hated each other. One's only got to see some of the descriptions of the Poles who'd just been invaded not just by the Soviets, but invaded by the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans, they suddenly found that they were brought out of the camps in the Soviet Union and allowed to join the army and fight alongside the Russians. So the communist Poles fought or those who were prepared to fight under a communist flag fought with on the Soviet side, but the vast majority preferred to fight with the Allies, and that's how they moved via Iran or Persia to Italy. All of these sort of contradictions, I think, make it completely impossible. There is no schema that one can sort of lay out. And I think that this is why it's such a sort of a huge subject, why I started in that particular way, that I think that historians still to this day are sort of awed by the sheer scope and complexity of the whole subject. I don't think any historian writing about the Second World War, even having spent their whole lives on it, are in a position really to sort of come out with fundamental judgments about the way that the whole thing worked or the way that the whole thing came about. You talk about anecdotal. In many ways, anecdotal is the only way of actually sort of illuminating the sort of the human angle of what are often the rather deadening and deadly statistics. Stalin's, of course, notoriously cynical remark about a million dead is a statistic, and one person dead is tragedy. And I think that is one of the problems of the Second World War, and I also think it's one of the most important observations, actually, of Vasily Grossman about recognizing the individuality of all of those who were, if you like, deliberately killed as part of either racial extermination or of class extermination in terms of the Soviet Union. So I think one has to sort of look at it from both sides. I don't think I can say very much more and prove on that very much. Yes. You got here. There's a microphone. Yep.
Sorry, a question. I'd just be interested to hear perhaps a bit about your experience of the Soviet and maybe the Eastern European archives.
Well, the Soviet archives, I can't go back to the Soviet archives, unfortunately, and because a law was brought in by the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, a number of years ago, in fact, both Catherine Meridell and I were in Estonia when the thing was announced, and we were warned by the Estonians saying, you're liable to 5 years imprisonment if you go back. So my experience, though, therefore, is rather out of date, if you like, because I was there. I first worked in them in 1992 when they opened. But at that stage, the military archives weren't open. They only opened up in 1995. And I was incredibly lucky in terms of timing, because that was just when I was working on the Stalingrad. But it was quite interesting. We had to negotiate with the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and the colonel there who was in charge, called Colonel Romanstiev, said to us, he said, we have a simple rule in our archives. You tell us the subject, we choose the files. There was no point sort of saying, well, actually, Colonel, that's not how it works in other archives. And I said, listen, I mean, you know that I want to write about the Battle of Stalingrad and all the rest of it. And I said, to give you an idea of the sort of material we're interested in the German archives at Freiburg, the most interesting files are those by outsiders, by doctors attached to German divisions or by chaplains, priests attached to them. Roar of laughter, of course, from the colonel saying, no priests in the Red Army. And I said, no, no, no. But where the real important material was, in fact, in the commissars' files and the political department files. And that's where we were incredibly lucky. But it was very strange because Pikoya, who was the minister of the archives, who'd been appointed by Yeltsin, had forced the military to open their archives, and they just simply didn't know how to handle it. Podolsk, where the main SAMO, the main central archive of the Ministry of Defense, is based, which is a couple of hours south of Moscow, there it had been a closed city until only a few years, just literally a few years before. The idea of foreigners being allowed into their Holy of Holies archive, even though it's about the Second World War, was for them almost a thing of sort of, licensed spying, and they just simply didn't know quite how to handle it. On the very first day, Luba and I had to sit opposite the colonel, Shuashin, so he could watch us as we sort of worked on the particular documents. But there was always a sort of strange mixture, slightly of sort of, paranoia and naivety in a way. Unfortunately, then suddenly they got bored of having us around or whatever, and we were stuck in another room, unsupervised. Because what they'd done was actually they had selected the passages that we were supposed to read, and everything else was forbidden. And now no Russian historian at that particular time, and even to a certain degree now, would dare to look at stuff which they were told they weren't allowed to look at, because they might never be allowed back into the archives again, and any young historian has got to have that ability, otherwise that's the end of it. Anyway, as I say, we were extremely lucky at that particular stage. There are some which are still open, obviously. It's mainly the military archives which are being closed down, or closed to foreigners, rather. There are others which have been marvelous in many ways. Our GASPI, the Russian State Archive for Social Political History, which was the old Comintern archive and the party archive, was always very rich pickings there, because quite often stuff which was forbidden in other archives, you would have found that copies had been sent to them, so you could always... But all of us who were working on Russia at that particular time, Orlando Figes, Simon Sebag Montefiore, Anne Applebaum, a whole range, we all knew each other. We were all exchanging as much information as we could, because quite often you found that material was being moved from one archive to another. And it was a question of sort of trying to identify where it was and so forth. And on the whole, I think that all of them, certainly all of the historians, were helping each other in that particular way. I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's as good as I can do at the moment in this time. Anybody else? Yes.
No, so I'm not sure if this is necessarily within your remit of study, but I was just wondering, from my own personal interest in my dissertation, whether you noticed any differences between Italian fascism at the beginning of the war and at the end of the war, particularly under the Sala Republic, and especially sort of how that may have continued through after the end of the World War, because obviously Italy wasn't necessarily as denazified in the same way as Germany was, and so we still see the remnants of that in the Movimento Sociale Italiano, and perhaps even late, and perhaps more specifically under figures such as Roberto Fiore, with the Terza Posizione. So I was hoping you might just be able to illuminate a little bit of that for me, and sort of what differences existed, and sort of what, perhaps, if there's any knowledge you may have on it, sort of what influences, in your opinion, Roberto Fiore took for his form of post-war fascism.
I'm not an Italian expert. In a way, I should be, because funny enough, my grandmother was the observer correspondent in Italy until she had to get out when the black shirts came to arrest her. And my father actually was the senior SOE officer in Italy. But I've never really studied Italian fascism properly from that point of view. I mean, obviously, I've read some books on it and so forth, but I wouldn't dare be. But you're quite right about the difference between Italian fascism in the way that it evolved. I mean, the Salo Republic was, shall we say, if you like, in a way, the purest form of unpleasant fascism in terms of gangster capitalism. Gangster fascism. That is certainly true. I mean, the earlier version was something which I think only a very small minority of Italians really believed in. I don't think this was a question of like Germans trying to pretend that they were never Nazis and all the rest of it. I think it was far more the case in Italy. People had to go through, whenever Mussolini appeared on the cinema screen, people had to jump up and give the fascist salute and all the rest of it. But I think the Italian peasant who had suffered so badly in the First World War was far more cynical about it. They knew they had to do what they were told and join up. But they were the first. I remember in the Russian archives, one of the interrogators of some of the Italian troops captured on the Eastern Front. The Russians said, well, why didn't you fire back when we attacked? And the Italian sergeant, we thought it was much safer not to, which I thought showed a very pragmatic attitude to life. Sorry, we want to ask a supplement.
I was just sort of wondering then, it sort of sounds almost in a way that Italian fascism revolved far more around an idea of death, a glory in death, and perhaps towards the end, a cult of death. Would
Yes.
you say that was far more prominent in Italian fascism than perhaps the German form?
Well, it did have, if you like, more of a cult of death, but it's a question of how seriously you took that cult of death. I mean, there were only a very small minority who tended to be the extreme hardliners who were left towards the end, fighting the partisans, certainly up in the north and so forth. But I mean, I would make more of a comparison with Vichy France, of the milice, who knew basically that they had their backs to the wall, and it was a question of, basically they knew they were going to get rounded up and probably killed. But the milice by the resistance, as we saw during the Epuration. Obviously the Italian fascists were certainly the sort of the parts of those from the Salo Republic when they were being sort of rounded up right towards the end. But inevitably, there was of course going to be those who managed to conceal themselves, and then they re-emerged after the war, and all the different varieties of Italian fascism.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for a fascinating talk. I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about how, over the course of your career, the ability to tap into the personal angle, right, the human angle of so much of what you cover has changed as generations have moved on. So have you found it more difficult? Have you found it almost liberating in a way?
Well, I think it's very important not to rely on oral testimony because we know how bad human memory is. I mean, the vital thing, of course, is to try to go for as many contemporary accounts as possible, and that's why diaries, letters, and so forth are so much more reliable. Diaries, of course, I find have always been the most reliable of all. Letters aren't always entirely reliable because it entirely depends how much people want to spare their family at home or whatever it might be. You can, when you're going through the archives, you can almost rate the different levels of reliability of some of the testimonies you're coming about. For example, when writing on Stalingrad, one of the most important ones I found was reports or debriefs of officers and soldiers who'd been flown out of Stalingrad at the last moment because they believed they had a duty to testify, and because their lives had been saved and they knew what horrors were awaiting all of those who'd been left behind there. And so reports like that are absolute gold. So, as I say, most of the diaries, I've often found actually most of the best diaries of the Second World War were written by women. Certainly in Germany and elsewhere, partly because I think they were living through a a moment of history, and they felt a need to record and observe and testify. I remember when researching Stalingrad, this was back in, say, roughly 1995 in Moscow, Anne Applebaum was also working on her Gulag book at the time, and we had dinner occasionally and sort of compared notes. And Anne suddenly said to me, well, she said, is it just because I'm a woman? But I mean, when I'm interviewing Gulag survivors, they sort of say, now, don't interrupt, sit down, I'll tell you what happened. And I said, no, I get more or less the same thing from, we get more or less the same thing from Red Army soldiers. But it was only we discussed it, and we realized that women actually were much more reliable. Russian women, Soviet women from that period were much more reliable witnesses. And it was only later, when I was going back to North Moscow in the metro, when it sort of struck me why, the reason for this was why. The men had been so humiliated in the course of their service. I mean, they were having to crawl out into no man's land to strip the uniforms off their dead comrades so that they could be recycled and given to other soldiers. They'd been so humiliated by their officers and by the political department and so forth. And now, here, all these years later, whatever it was then, 60 years later, I'll say, here were foreign historians asking them for their memories. And, of course, they were now in control of history. The women, on the other hand, had simply kept their eyes open and their mouths shut, and they were far more reliable in what they had to say. The men would always like to put themselves, of course, in the center of events. So, Marshal Zhukov came along and sort of asked me what I thought and all the rest of it. Unbelievable, some of the stories you sort of heard in that way. So that all became very, very, very unreliable. But basically, the ideal was really an account written at the time. I remember there was this famous case of a professor at Columbia who, the day after 9/11, asked his students to write down exactly what they'd done and seen the day before on 9/11. And he took their accounts, and then 10 years later, he asked them to do exactly the same exercise and compared them. There was no comparison whatsoever. Which I think is probably the best proof of how totally unreliable human memory is. So that's, in a way, why I think one needs to go back mainly to, as far as one can, to contemporary sources. Yeah.
You mentioned Japan during the war.
Yeah.
What do you make of the American sort of attempt at reconstruction there after the war, and how well do you think it went?
Well, what's interesting, because you mentioned defascization, or as opposed to denazification in Italy, the thing was that General MacArthur was determined not to, they were afraid of some sort of, communist takeover or whatever it might be, or communist influence within Japan. And so MacArthur was determined not to have any upset. And in fact, they were actually, as you know probably, using some of the worst Japanese war criminals to extract information which might be useful, particularly the commanders of the Harbin unit, which have been carrying out these appalling tests on human guinea pigs. So as a result, there was no real what can one say for Japan, but basically detoxification of the psychology of many of the Japanese commanders and individuals. And they were allowed, therefore, by keeping the emperor, by pretending really that very little had changed. I think this is why we find that Japan has not changed very much in its attitude, certainly not of the older generation. Whether it's the Yakushuni shrine and everything like that, there has not really been any real expressions of regret or apology for the past. And I think that actually is one of the more shocking aspects of Japan, and why we see the tensions still, whether with Korea and with China, which still do affect politics very much in the Far East. But as I say, that process of detoxification was completely absent there. And in fact, as I said, with the Tokyo War Crimes trial, many things were avoided and passed over. And there's still quite a lot of anger, I think, in certain areas, why in Australia and a number of other places, those of families who had suffered under Japanese imprisonment or whatever, have certainly sort of never really forgiven the Japanese in that particular way. Great. Well, I think, yes, sorry, Brent.
You briefly mentioned the Spanish Civil War, and I was wondering if you could shed a bit more light on your opinion on some interpretations on the Spanish Civil War as a testing ground for World War II.
Sorry, the Spanish Civil War, can you
Sorry.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could shed a bit more light on, you briefly mentioned the interpretation of the Spanish Civil War as a kind of precursor or as part of World War II. I was wondering of your opinion on how much the Spanish Civil War influenced World War II.
No, well, I mean, it's an interesting and almost sort of unanswerable one of the effect of the Spanish Civil War on the Second World War. The interesting thing about the Spanish Civil War, of course, it's one of the few conflicts in history where the losers have actually written the history. But that was partly because the fascist version or the Frankist version of the Spanish Civil War was so badly written and was so unbelievable because of the fascist propaganda, which sort of that the version of on the Republican side was always the accepted one internationally, and so as I say, it is an exception in that particular way. Spain is still, I think the problem was that they didn't have a real debate earlier on. If one's talking about the way that they still see the Spanish Civil War. I mean, I remember being horrified after my book on the Spanish Civil War came out, the way that sort of, young Spanish journalists were sort of saying, now, do you think there's a chance for another Spanish Civil War or whatever? You would say, well, hang on a second, the conditions are totally different. We're not living through the depression of the 1930s combined with the memories of the Russian Civil War, which had affected the Spanish Civil War so much. It was, above all, the other big debate which I've had with Spanish historians has been very much on the case of to what degree do words kill? Now, most in Spain try to sort of say, oh, no, it's just rhetoric, you can't take it seriously. Well, actually, I wouldn't agree with that at all, because in fact there was such a vicious circle of rhetoric between the extreme left and the extreme right. The way that Calvo Sotelo, more or less by his speeches in the Cortes, more or less provoked his own death. And at the same time, you then had Largo Caballero of PSOE, the leading socialist and later prime minister, who was calling for the extermination of the bourgeoisie even before. When you get a sort of a vicious circle of fear, and each side is fearing what the others have been saying, then there is always the danger of getting in a sort of preemptive strike. The preemptive strike could have come. In fact, many argue today that the Asturias Rising of October 1934 was the opening round of the Spanish Civil War, because that basically meant that the Spanish Civil War could not be avoided. The bourgeoisie, the middle class, was so terrified by this attempt at revolution by the miners in Asturias and the attempt to overthrow the government in October 1934, that this inevitably, well, I'd say inevitably, nothing one should say is inevitable, but this, not surprisingly, provoked a reaction on the right and a preparation where the military were being called upon by civilians. I mean, sometimes officers were even insulted in the street, saying, why don't you sort of overthrow this government? And this was from the start of January 36. So words did play a very, very strong part in that particular way. But above all, as I say, it's this question of mutual fear becoming a vicious circle, which led to a large degree to the outbreak. The other element, which some people tend to overlook, of course, is the demographic contribution, or the way that, of course, Spain had been neutral in the First World War. Suddenly, there was a huge boom in wages, and there was a population boom as a result. By 1918, in fact, it was sort of 16, 17, 18, huge population boom. And here we have 18-year-olds, 1936, who simply couldn't find work. So there was inevitably a problem. It's also one of the problems, as people have analyzed, in North Africa at the moment, where you have a population boom and you have a lot of young males who cannot find work. There is always a greater danger of conflict. And that certainly was another aspect of the Spanish Civil War, which has often perhaps been overlooked. But the real question came, I think, when there was no real debate about the Spanish Civil War after Franco's death. Franco died in 1975. There was then that sort of interregnum period where nobody really knew what the future was going to hold. Then eventually there was a progress into democracy, but there was still always the threat of a military coup. But then in 1981, of course, we had the Tejero coup, where he went charging into the Cortes and firing off his guns and so forth. And people in Spain felt, let's just keep quiet. And try and forget about the past and fast forward into the future. And the modernization of Spain during that period was astonishing. I mean, considering how backward Spain had been and how rapidly it caught up with the rest of Europe during that particular period. But in a way, it was a problem because it's rather like France too. When you have a really deep sort of civil wound in the body politic, if you want, and you can bandage it up for a time, but you've got to take that bandage off pretty soon, otherwise the wound starts to stink. And that happened very much in France, to a large degree, with the whole question of Vichy, the milice, and all the rest of it, and the way that still has influenced France for quite a long time afterwards, but also in Spain, and the way that the refusal basically to look at it meant that when the whole question of the desaparecidos, the disappeared, the question of the Republican orphans taken away and basically indoctrinated by the church. When you take into account all of that, one sees the way that inevitably it was going to become politicized. And I think that was a great danger and didn't help. But anyway, I mean, there's no doubt at the moment. I think that Spain, though, is starting to see the way that the old Franquism, the old fascism of the past, is actually now being modernized, I'm afraid, by Vox, the new sort of right-wing anti-immigrant party. And we're starting to see a similar pattern in Spain as we've seen elsewhere. Spain had far less anti-immigrant rhetoric before, far less than Italy, far less than Greece or anything like that. And now, in fact, suddenly that's sort of catching up in rather a dangerous way, and we're starting to see the way that, the extreme right and the PP, the Partido Popular, is starting to sort of trying to make a coalition. And we will see when it comes to the elections. But I'm afraid there are always going to be a number of echoes of the past, which do certainly go back to the Spanish Civil War. But as for the Second World War and its influence on that, you could say that the Spanish Civil War was a world war by proxy, as has often been said, or a sort of trial run for the Second World War. One certainly saw, and from a military point of view, the way that it was used as a sort of testing ground, much more by the Germans and the Italians than by the Soviets, but that was partly for ideological reasons in the Soviet Union. I think that's probably about enough. I'm sure we probably had enough of that.
Yeah, sorry to break up the fun, but we have another event going.
Right, absolutely. That's fine. Great.
Thank you so much for this, and can everybody give Antony a round of applause?
Great, thanks.